Arthur Pierce considered punctuality one of the greatest virtues in the business world. A lack of it, on the other hand, was a sign of carelessness, a character flaw he could barely tolerate. So when his assistant called to inform him that his 3 o'clock meeting had been cancelled due to a client emergency, his first reaction was a wave of irritation. Inefficiency annoyed him to his core. He glanced at his wristwatch, an expensive, precise object that seemed to mock the suddenly vacant time before him. It was 2:45. What was one to do with a Tuesday afternoon that had suddenly opened up, empty and without purpose? Driving his luxury car through the city's bustling streets, Arthur felt like a stranger. He was used to seeing the world through the window of his 20th floor office, a distant, silent landscape of buildings and lights. Down here, at street level, the afternoon sun beat hard against the windshield, and the constant flow of people and vehicles felt chaotic, disorderly. His thoughts, normally occupied with spreadsheets, market projections, and acquisition strategies, were strangely quiet. For the first time in a long while, there was no urgent problem to solve, no decision to be made. There was only the drive home, a home he rarely returned to before 8 at night. A large, imposing and, for the most part, silent house. Ever since his wife had passed away 3 years ago, the place had lost its soul. Now it was just a structure of concrete and glass, a functional space where he slept, dressed, and occasionally saw his daughter, Laura. Laura's illness had made the silence in the house even heavier. The girl, at 8 years old, was slowly fading. It wasn't just the hair loss, a visible and cruel side effect of the treatment. It was the loss of her laughter, the sparkle in her eyes, the childish energy that once filled every corner. Arthur fought the situation the only way he knew how, with resources. He hired the best doctors, bought the most expensive medications, and ensured she had every possible material comfort. Yet he felt helpless, a distant spectator to his own daughter's sadness. He decided to enter through the back door, which gave direct access to the hallway leading to his home office. It was a habit, a way to immediately isolate himself in his refuge, even at home. He set his leather briefcase on a small table, took off his jacket, and loosened the knot of his tie. And that's when he heard it. Voices. They were coming from the living room, a soft woman's voice, and another, thinner and more hesitant, which he recognized as Laura's. He furrowed his brow. No one else was supposed to be there. The housekeeper didn't arrive until later, and Laura's nurse had the day off. He then remembered the cleaner, the woman who had been hired a few months ago. What was her name again? Isabella, perhaps. He wasn't sure. He barely saw her, as their schedules rarely coincided. Curiosity, a feeling Arthur rarely allowed himself, got the better of him. He walked slowly down the hall, the soles of his expensive shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. Why would the cleaner be talking to his daughter like that? He expected her to be doing her job, cleaning, not providing a distraction. A prickle of irritation returned, but it was quickly replaced by something else when he neared the half-open living room door. The woman's voice was calm, almost a whisper. "I don't have any hair either, see? Just like you." Arthur stopped, his hand hovering in the air, inches from the doorknob. He leaned in slightly, peering through the crack in the door. What he saw made him hold his breath, a moment so intimate and unexpected that it left him paralyzed in the hallway, an intruder in his own home. From his vantage point in the dim hallway, Arthur watched the scene unfold with a painful clarity. The cleaner, Isabella, was sitting on the Persian rug that had cost a small fortune, but which had never looked so right in its place as it did at that moment. Her back was straight, and she showed no sign of self-consciousness. Beside her, sitting cross-legged, was Laura. The afternoon light streaming through the window illuminated them both, creating a kind of sanctuary in the middle of the living room. Arthur's heart tightened. Isabella's head was smooth and pale, vulnerable under the light, and yet she radiated a strength he couldn't comprehend. She had removed her wig. a barrier she used to navigate the world, and placed it on the floor beside her as if it were an unimportant object. She had done it for his daughter, to build a bridge over the abyss of loneliness into which Laura had sunk. Laura's eyes, which Arthur had grown accustomed to seeing dull and distant, were wide, but not with fear or shock. It was fascination, a pure, childlike curiosity. For the first time in months, she didn't look like a patient, a victim of her illness, but just a little girl discovering something new about the world. And then a smile began to form on her lips. It wasn't a forced smile, like the one she gave the doctors, or a weak smile that barely had the strength to appear. It was a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes and made them shine. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. He, with all his power and money, hadn't been able to draw a smile like that from his daughter. He had given her gifts, toys, everything she asked for. He had hired psychologists and therapists. Nothing had worked. And now this woman, to whom he had barely spoken a word, had succeeded with a single gesture of honesty and empathy. Laura's voice, small and a little hoarse from disuse, broke the silence. "Why don't you have hair?" she asked, and her small hand reached out, touching Isabella's head with hesitant delicacy. Isabella didn't flinch. On the contrary, she leaned slightly into the girl's touch, a gesture of total acceptance. "I have a condition called alopecia," she explained, her voice as soft and patient as someone talking about the weather. "It's a complicated name for my body, deciding it doesn't need hair, just like your body is fighting a sickness and the medicine makes your hair fall out. In a way, it's kind of the same thing, isn't it?" Laura nodded, her hand still resting on Isabella's head. "Do people stare at you on the street?" "Sometimes," Isabella admitted. "At first, I was really ashamed. I wore scarves, hats, and then the wig. I was afraid of what other people would think. But one day, I realized something." She paused, making sure she had the girl's full attention. "I realized that what people think doesn't change who I am on the inside. And in here," she said, tapping her chest with her fingertips, "I'm strong and beautiful. Hair isn't part of that. And you are strong and beautiful too, Laura. Much more than you know." Arthur pulled back from the door, feeling like an intruder. That moment wasn't for him. It was sacred, a secret shared between two souls who had found a mirror in each other. He turned and walked back to his office, moving like a sleepwalker. He closed the door behind him with a nearly inaudible click and leaned against it, closing his eyes. The image of that scene was burned into his mind. His daughter's smile, Isabella's dignity. In that instant, he understood the scale of his own failure. He'd been treating Laura's illness like a business problem. Identify the issue, allocate resources, await results. He had never sat on the floor with her. He had never shared his own vulnerability. He didn't even know how. The truth hit him like a punch. He barely knew the woman who cleaned his house, but in that moment, she knew his daughter better than he did. Arthur spent the rest of the afternoon locked in his office, but he didn't work. The spreadsheets open on his computer screen seemed distant, the numbers meaningless. His mind was a whirlwind of images and feelings he wasn't used to processing. He, a man who had built an empire on logic, control, and the ability to predict outcomes, felt completely lost. The image of Isabella and Laura sitting together on the floor wouldn't leave him. It was as if a bright light had been switched on in a room of his life he'd kept in shadows, revealing dust and disarray he never knew existed. He felt ashamed of his own blindness, of his emotional distance. How could he have thought that money could heal a wound in the soul? He had surrounded Laura with everything money could buy, but had deprived her of the one thing that might actually heal her, a genuine human connection, someone who could look at her and say, "I understand." He didn't know how to do that. His wife, Clara, had been the one with that gift. She knew how to calm Laura's storms with a hug, how to decipher her silences. Since Clara was gone, Arthur had tried to fill her role, but he acted like a manager running a project, not a father caring for a child. Later, at dinner, he watched Laura from across the long mahogany table. The housekeeper served the food in silence. As always, the clinking of silverware was the only sound. But something was different. There was a lightness in Laura's expression that hadn't been there that morning. She ate a little more than usual, and at one point she looked up and met his gaze. A small, almost imperceptible ghost of the smile he'd seen earlier touched her lips. Arthur felt his heart race. He wanted to say something, to ask about her day, about her conversation with Isabella, but the words wouldn't come. They felt inadequate, heavy. He just smiled back, an awkward smile that probably looked more like a grimace. Laura looked down at her plate again, and the moment was gone. The opportunity had slipped through his fingers. That night, lying in his bed, staring at the ceiling, he made a decision. He couldn't let that spark of hope die out. He couldn't go back to being a spectator in his own family's life. The next day, work was a blur. Arthur attended meetings, signed documents, and answered emails. But his mind was elsewhere. He checked his watch every 10 minutes, anxious. For the first time, the urgency he felt wasn't about a contract or a deadline. It was about getting home. At 2:30, he stood up, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out of his office, much to his secretary's surprise. This time, when he got home, he didn't go to his office. He walked through the front door and headed deliberately toward the kitchen, where a faint noise of activity could be heard. He found Isabella with her back to him, wiping down the marble countertop with efficient, methodical movements. She was wearing her wig again, styled in a neat, low bun. For an instant, she looked like the same anonymous employee as before, but Arthur knew she wasn't. He saw her differently now. He cleared his throat to announce his presence. Isabella turned, startled. Her eyes widened when she saw him there, so early. She immediately dried her hands on a cloth, her posture becoming stiff and formal. "Mr. Pierce, I wasn't expecting you. Is something wrong?" Arthur felt nervous, like a teenager about to give a speech. "No, nothing's wrong," he said, his voice a little louder than he intended. He took a deep breath. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you. Yesterday I saw you with my daughter." The surprise on Isabella's face gave way to an expression of contained panic. She wrung the cloth in her hands, her face flushing. "Oh, sir, I apologize if I overstepped my bounds. I shouldn't have. Laura seemed so sad, and I just wanted to—" "No," Arthur interrupted, more gently this time. "No, please, don't apologize." He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I came to thank you. No one, not me, not the doctors, no one has been able to make her smile like that in months. What you did yesterday, it was the first time I've seen the real Laura in a very long time." The relief on Isabella's face was visible, as if a storm cloud had just dissipated. The tension in her shoulders eased, and she set the cleaning cloth down on the counter. Arthur's gratitude, so unexpected, left her speechless. She could only manage a small, shy nod. For her, what she had done in the living room hadn't been a calculated act, but an impulse of the heart, an instinctive reaction to seeing a child's silent pain. She never imagined that the father, that imposing and distant man, would have even noticed. Arthur, for his part, felt he needed to say more, that a simple "thank you" wasn't enough to express the depth of what he felt. He found himself fighting a lifelong habit of keeping conversations short, efficient, and impersonal. He hesitated for a moment, feeling strangely vulnerable in his own kitchen. Do you really have the same condition she does?" he asked, his voice lower, almost a whisper. The question felt invasive, but he had to know. He needed to understand if that gesture of solidarity was even deeper than he had imagined. Isabella met his gaze, and for the first time, Arthur didn't see an employee, but a woman with a complex history etched in her eyes. She nodded again, this time more firmly. "Yes, alopecia. Since I was 15, she answered. Straightforward. I wear a wig because, most of the time, it makes other people more comfortable. It's easier to avoid the questions, the looks of pity." The simplicity of that confession hit Arthur hard. He thought of all the times he had passed Isabella in the hallways, seeing only a uniform, a function. It had never occurred to him that beneath the veneer of normalcy, she carried a daily struggle, a vulnerability that connected her so intimately to his own daughter. He, who prided himself on his ability to assess people, to read their intentions at a negotiating table, felt like a complete amateur. His mind, trained to identify problems and find solutions, began to work in a different way. Laura's problem wasn't just medical, it was emotional. The solution wasn't another expensive specialist or a new experimental treatment. The solution, or at least the beginning of it, was right here, in front of him. Cleaning his marble countertop, an idea, audacious and sudden, began to form. "Isabella," he said, the tone of his voice changing, becoming more serious, more focused. "I have a proposal for you." She looked at him, confused. "A proposal, sir?" "I want you to work here in a different capacity," he continued, the words now flowing with more certainty. "I want you to be a companion for Laura, to spend time with her, talk with her, maybe help her with her school lessons. Someone who understands her in a way that I, evidently, cannot." He paused, the admission of his own failure hanging in the air between them. "I'll pay you triple your current salary. More, if necessary. This isn't about the money." Isabella took a step back, shock written all over her face. She shook her head slightly, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "Mr. Pierce, I'm a cleaner. I don't have any qualifications to be a tutor or a companion. You have the only qualification that matters," Arthur insisted, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised him. "You made her smile. You made her feel less alone. That's something no diploma can teach." He saw the hesitation in her eyes, doubt wrestling with surprise. She looked down at her own hands, then back at him. The kitchen, once a space of formality and distance, had become the stage for a decision that had the power to change everything. For Arthur, it wasn't just a job offer. It was an act of desperation and hope, a recognition that he couldn't fix his family alone. He needed help, and that help had arrived in the most unexpected way. The offer hung in the air, heavy and full of possibilities, awaiting an answer that could open a door to a future neither of them had ever imagined. Isabella looked at Arthur's earnest face, searching for any sign that this was a momentary impulse, a bad joke, or a misunderstanding, but there was none. His eyes, which she had always seen as hard and analytical, now held an almost desperate sincerity. The offer was real, and because it was real, it was terrifying. Triple her salary was a life-changing amount of money, enough to let her rent a better apartment, to stop worrying about every bill. But the responsibility that came with it scared her. Taking care of a house was one thing. Taking care of a wounded soul was another entirely. "Mr. Pierce, I don't know what to say," she stammered, her brain trying to process the magnitude of the proposal. "I appreciate the trust. I really do, but I'm not the right person. I clean houses, I like children, but I've never had any formal training." She felt she had to be honest, to make him understand her limits before he made a mistake. "What I did with Laura yesterday, it wasn't planned. It was just a feeling. I wouldn't know how to do that every day. She needs a professional." Arthur didn't waver. "I've had professionals," he said, his voice low and laced with an old frustration. "I've had psychologists, therapists, specialized nurses. They come with their degrees and their techniques, but they talk to Laura like she's a problem to be solved. You talk to her like she was a person." He paused, and the silence in the kitchen seemed to amplify the weight of his words. "Please, Isabella, Just consider it. Isabella looked away, her gaze fixing on a random spot on the wall. Her mind went back in time to another life, a life before the illness, before the shame, before she had to give up on everything. A life where she sat in a university classroom, surrounded by books, dreaming of becoming a teacher. She had always wanted to work with children, to understand them, to help them flourish. Education had been her passion, the path she had chosen before life had so cruelly derailed her. An unexpected courage bloomed inside her. If he was offering her a door, maybe she could ask for a window. She raised her head and looked directly at him. "Sir, there's something you don't know about me," she began, her voice firmer now. Before the alopecia got worse, I was in college, majoring in education. I had to drop out halfway through. The medical bills, the difficulty finding a job, everything just got too complicated. She took a deep breath, revealing her deepest dream. "I accept your proposal, but on one condition. I want to go back to school. If I'm going to help Laura, I want to do it the right way. I want to learn, to have the tools to really make a difference for her." She expected him to see it as a complication, an obstacle. Perhaps he wanted someone with exclusive dedication, but to her complete surprise, Arthur's expression softened. A glint of genuine respect appeared in his eyes. He wasn't just hearing her, he was understanding. "That's not a condition, Isabella," he said after a moment. "That's a bonus." He stepped forward, extending his hand. "Not only do I agree, I insist on paying for your tuition. Consider it part of your new job. A happier, more fulfilled tutor will be a much better companion for my daughter." The tears Isabella had been holding back finally escaped. They weren't tears of sadness or fear, but of overwhelming gratitude. This man, who until yesterday had just been her distant boss, was offering her not just a job, but the chance to reclaim a dream she thought was lost forever. She shook his hand, a gesture that sealed far more than a work agreement. It sealed the beginning of a partnership, an unlikely alliance born from a simple act of kindness on a Tuesday afternoon. The transition was, for Arthur, the strangest part. The following Monday, Isabella arrived at the usual time, but she wasn't wearing the blue uniform from the cleaning company. She wore simple jeans and a yellow cotton blouse, a color that seemed to channel the sunlight. She carried a backpack instead of a bucket and mop. She looked younger, less anonymous. When Arthur opened the door, they both stood there for a moment, an awkward silence hanging between them, as if they were renegotiating the rules of their relationship. "Good morning, Isabella. Please, come in," Arthur said, stepping aside. "Good morning, Mr. Pierce," she replied, the formality still present in her voice. He led her to the living room, where Laura was sitting on the sofa, flipping through a book without much interest. The girl looked up as they entered. There was a cautious curiosity in her eyes as she saw Isabella there, dressed in normal clothes, with no cleaning supplies in sight. Arthur felt like he was giving a business presentation. "Laura, starting today, Isabella is going to be spending the afternoons with you, to talk, read, or whatever else you two want to do." He looked from his daughter to Isabella, suddenly feeling like an intruder. "I'll be in my office if you need anything." With that, he retreated, leaving the two of them alone. But unlike his usual days, he didn't dive into his work. He closed his office door but left it slightly ajar. He sat at his desk, but his attention was entirely focused on the sounds, or lack thereof, coming from the other room. He expected to hear a forced conversation, an awkward attempt to break the ice. Instead, he heard silence. 5, 10, 15 minutes passed. The silence was so profound that Arthur started to worry. Had he made a terrible mistake? Was Laura rejecting Isabella's presence? He got up and walked to the door, peering through the crack. Isabella wasn't trying to force an interaction. She had taken a seat in an armchair at a respectful distance from Laura. From her backpack, she had pulled out a sketchbook and a pencil. Without a word, She began to draw. Her movements were calm and focused. Laura, from the sofa, was watching her, not with suspicion, but with genuine interest. The absence of pressure, the lack of questions about how she was feeling, seemed to have created a safe space for the girl. After a few more minutes, Isabella looked up from her drawing and smiled at Laura. "I'm not very good at this, but I like the sound the pencil makes on the paper." Laura didn't reply, but her eyes followed Isabella's hand as she continued to sketch. Later that day, Arthur looked out his office window, which overlooked the backyard. Isabella and Laura were sitting on the grass under the shade of a large oak tree. There were two open sketchbooks between them. Isabella was pointing to a flower in one of the beds, saying something Arthur couldn't hear. Laura, for the first time in a long time, was outside by choice. Arthur watched the scene, fascinated. He had always tried to fill Laura's time with activities, with distractions. He bought puzzles, games, movies. His approach was always about doing something to avoid thinking about the sadness. Isabella's approach was the opposite. She wasn't trying to fill the silence, she was sharing it. She wasn't offering distractions, but rather her calm, unwavering presence. She was simply being. At the end of the afternoon, as Isabella was getting ready to leave, Arthur met her in the hallway. "How did it go?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "It was a quiet day," Isabella answered with a soft smile. "Laura showed me her favorite tree in the garden. It might seem small to anyone else, but to Arthur it was monumental. Laura hadn't shown interest in anything for months. The fact that she had shared a preference, however minor, was like the first green sprout appearing after a long, harsh winter. That night, as he said goodnight to his daughter, Arthur noticed the sketchbook beside her bed. He picked it up. On the first page was a somewhat crooked drawing of a large tree with branches that looked like open arms. He felt his eyes well up. That simple drawing was proof that he had made the right decision. Hope, a feeling he had almost forgotten, began to take root in his heart. The following weeks unfolded into a new routine, a gentle rhythm that began to heal the silent wounds of the house. The afternoons were no longer filled with a heavy, oppressive silence, but with whispered conversations, the sound of pencils on paper, and, occasionally, Laura's stifled laugh, a sound that to Arthur was more valuable than any closed deal. He began to adjust his own schedule, finding excuses to come home earlier, not to supervise, but to bear witness. He had become a hungry observer, learning about his own daughter through her interactions with Isabella. He learned that Laura had a fascination with ants and could spend nearly an hour watching them march across the garden. He discovered that she disliked the color purple but loved the blue of the sky just before sunset. They were small details, trivial perhaps, but to Arthur they were like pieces of a puzzle he was finally beginning to assemble. They were fragments of his daughter's personality that the illness had obscured, and which Isabella, with her infinite patience, was bringing back into the light. One day, watching from his window, he saw Isabella and Laura kneeling in the dirt of an empty flower bed. Isabella was showing the girl how to make a small hole with her fingers and place a seed inside. They weren't wearing gloves, and their hands were covered in soil. The image was so simple, so fundamental, yet it struck Arthur with unexpected force. He was used to building things, to erecting skyscrapers of steel and glass, but there, in that small patch of earth, the two of them were cultivating life in a way he had never known how. That evening, at dinner, the usual silence felt more inviting than oppressive. Spurred on by a courage he didn't know he had, Arthur broke the quiet. "I saw you two in the garden today," he said, his voice a little hesitant. "What did you plant?" Laura looked up from her plate, surprised that he had noticed. For a moment, Arthur feared she would shut down, that his question had been too direct. But then she answered, her voice low but clear. "Sunflowers. Isabella says they always turn to find the sun, no matter where it is." Arthur's heart leaped. He smiled, a genuine, effortless smile. "That's a beautiful lesson," he said softly. It was a short conversation, just 2 sentences, but it felt like one of the most important of his life. However, life rarely follows a straight line of progress. Proof of that arrived on a Friday afternoon, in the form of a letter-headed envelope from Laura's school. It was a standard letter, a reminder for re-enrollment for the next semester, which would begin in a few months. Arthur left the letter on the coffee table, planning to deal with the bureaucracy later. He didn't count on Laura seeing it. When Isabella arrived, she found the girl curled up on the sofa, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the letter as if it were a snake. The progress of the past few weeks seemed to evaporate in an instant. She refused to go outside, to draw, to speak. The cocoon of silence that Isabella had worked so hard to open had snapped shut again. Later, feeling defeated, Arthur went to find Isabella in the kitchen. "It was the letter from school," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "I don't know what to do. She's not ready to go back. The other kids, the stares, the questions. She won't be able to handle it." Isabella listened intently, her face as calm as ever. She didn't offer easy solutions or false reassurances. Instead, she looked at Arthur and said something that would change his perspective forever. "Of course she's scared, Mr. Pierce. Fear is a normal reaction. The problem isn't the fear itself, but what we do with it." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We can't build a wall around her to protect her from the world, but we can teach her how to build a bridge to cross her fear. And we build that bridge one step at a time." Isabella's words echoed in the quiet kitchen, simple and profound. Arthur felt as though a window had been opened in a stuffy room. Build a bridge, not a wall. The metaphor was so clear, so precise, that it filled him with a renewed shame for never having thought of something like it. He had always been a man of walls, of defenses, of fortresses. Bridges were for connecting, for showing vulnerability, a concept that was foreign to him in business and, he now realized, in his personal life as well. He looked at Isabella, who was drying a glass with a calm that seemed unshakable. The question arose from a genuine curiosity, a need to understand the source of her wisdom. "How did you learn that?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "How did you build your own bridge?" Isabella stopped what she was doing and leaned against the counter, her gaze lost in a distant memory. Arthur remained silent, giving her the space she needed. He sensed he was about to hear something important, a piece of her story that would explain the strength he so admired. "I was 15 when it all started," she said, her voice low. "A terrible age to feel different. My hair was falling out in clumps. First, I tried to hide it with different hairstyles. Then, with headbands and scarves, the mirror became my enemy. Every morning was a battle against my own reflection." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I pulled away from my friends. I made up excuses not to go to parties, not to go to the pool. My world kept shrinking until it was the size of my bedroom. The illness wasn't just taking my hair, it was stealing my life, my joy." Arthur listened, motionless, feeling the weight of every word. He thought of Laura, locked in her own room, in her own silence. Isabella's story was the future he feared for his daughter. "The turning point," Isabella continued, "wasn't some big moment of courage. It was a moment of profound sadness. There was a spring festival at my school. All my friends were going. I had a new dress. I was excited. But on the night of the festival, I looked at myself in the mirror. Wearing the wig my parents had bought me, I didn't recognize myself. It felt like a costume, a lie. I was so scared someone would find out, that the wig would fall off, that everyone would laugh at me. So I decided not to go." She looked at Arthur, and her eyes were moist. "I stayed home, in my room, listening to the distant sound of the music, and I realized I wasn't hiding from other people. I was hiding from myself. The alopecia hadn't locked me in that room. The fear had, in that moment, I understood that the wall I was building to protect myself was actually my prison. The next day, I did something that felt like the scariest thing in the world. I tied a simple scarf around my head and walked to the corner bakery. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. People stared, yes, some of them whispered it was awful. But I didn't fall apart. I bought my bread, went home, and realized I had survived. That was the first plank in my bridge. Small, fragile, but it was a start. She finished her story, and a respectful silence settled in the kitchen. Arthur felt an immense admiration for this woman. Her journey had not been easy, but she had transformed it into wisdom, into empathy. He finally understood the depth of Laura's fear because Isabella had just given him a map of the territory. "Laura is at the beginning of that walk," Isabella said, bringing the conversation back to the present. The letter from school made her look across the chasm, and the fear paralyzed her. Arthur nodded, his brain processing everything he had heard. The frustration he'd felt before had transformed into determination. He was no longer a helpless spectator. He had a guide. He looked at Isabella, no longer as a boss to an employee, but as an apprentice to his teacher. "So," he said, his voice firm and clear. "What's the first step? What's the first plank in Laura's bridge?" Isabella looked at Arthur's eager face and offered him a small smile, a gesture that seemed to say, "Calm down, we'll get there." His question, "What's the first plank?" was that of a practical man, a builder who needed a blueprint, a floor plan for the soul. Isabella understood that. "The first plank can't be the school," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "That's the other side of the bridge. The first plank has to be something small, a public place, but not a loud one, a place where people are too busy to notice others, a place where she feels safe." Arthur furrowed his brow, trying to think. "A park? A movie theater?" Isabella shook her head. "A park is too open. A movie theater is dark, but the entrance and exit are chaotic. I was thinking, a bookstore, it's quiet. People are focused on the books. And it's an environment she already loves." The simplicity of the idea was brilliant. A bookstore, it was perfect, a natural haven for Laura, a place she associated with pleasure and discovery. "Right, a bookstore," Arthur agreed, feeling a wave of relief. "How do we do it? Do I just tell her we're going?" "No," Isabella said gently. "We invite her, and we give her control of the decision." Later, the two of them sat with Laura in the living room. The girl was still quiet, the school letter forgotten on the table, but its shadow still lingered in the air. Isabella leaned forward. "Laura, I had an idea. I know thinking about school is scary right now. So, how about we do something completely different? I would love to visit that big bookstore downtown. They say it has a children's section that looks like an enchanted forest. Would you like to go with me and your dad to check it out? No strings attached. If you don't like it, we'll come right back." Laura looked up, surprise mixed with fear. Leaving the house, going downtown, the idea was terrifying. Her shoulders slumped. "People will stare at me." Arthur's heart broke, but he forced himself to stay silent, to trust the process, to trust Isabella. Isabella nodded, validating the girl's feeling. "Yes, they might," she admitted with disarming honesty. "People look at anything that's different. But you know what I've learned? A look only lasts for a second. It's like a raindrop. It hits you and then it's gone. It can't hurt you, and we'll be there with you, one on each side. We'll be your team." Arthur added his part, his voice calm. "And you can pick out any book you want, any one, or even two." Laura looked from Isabella to her father. She saw the sincerity in their eyes. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. She bit her lower lip, thinking. The image of an enchanted forest made of books battled the monster of fear in her mind. After a long minute of silence, she whispered a single word. "Okay." The car ride was tense. Laura sat silently in the back seat, staring out the window without seeing the scenery. Arthur drove with his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Only Isabella seemed calm, telling a story about a bird that kept trying to build a nest on her window. Inside the bookstore, the smell of paper and ink soothed everyone's nerves a little. As Isabella had said, the place was quiet, almost reverent. They made their way to the children's section, which was indeed wonderful, with bookshelves shaped like trees and colourful beanbags scattered on the floor. Laura stood at the entrance, amazed but hesitant. That's when it happened. A little girl, slightly younger than Laura, walked past them, stopped, and pointed. "Mommy, look! That girl has no hair." Arthur felt his blood boil. He took a step forward, ready to say something to protect his daughter, but Isabella's hand touched his arm. A light but firm touch. "Let it be," she whispered. Isabella knelt beside Laura, completely ignoring the other child and her mother, who was pulling her away in embarrassment. "Laura, look at this cover," Isabella said, pointing to a book on a low shelf. "It's about a dragon who couldn't breathe fire. All the other dragons made fun of him." She picked up the book and handed it to Laura. "What do you think he did?" The distraction was perfect. Laura, who had shrunk back at the other girl's comment, was now looking at the book's cover. Curiosity overcame humiliation. She opened the book, and the world around her began to disappear. She spent the next hour exploring the shelves, her fear forgotten. She chose the dragon book and another one about a girl who travelled to the stars. At the register, she handed the books to the cashier herself, a small act of independence that filled Arthur's heart with pride. On the way home, the silence in the car was different. It wasn't tense, it was peaceful. Laura flipped through her new treasures. When they arrived, she ran to her room to read. That night, Arthur found Isabella in the kitchen, getting ready to leave. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Today, I saw a plank being laid on the bridge." Isabella smiled. "She's the one who laid it, Mr. Pierce. We just handed her the wood and the hammer." The victory at the bookstore wasn't a one-time event, it was a seed. In the days that followed, Arthur noticed a subtle but undeniable shift in the house's atmosphere. The air felt lighter, less heavy with unspoken sorrows. Laura spent hours immersed in her new books, the stories of the fireless dragon and the star-traveling girl becoming her refugees. She even started bringing the books to the dinner table, propping them against her empty plate and rereading her favorite passages in silence. Arthur didn't scold her. He saw the books not as a distraction, but as armor she was building for herself, crafted from imagination and courage. Isabella continued her work with a wisdom that seemed innate. She never pushed Laura to talk about her fears, but created opportunities for bravery to blossom. They started doing little courage tests, as Isabella called them. The first was answering the door when the delivery man came. Laura stood behind Isabella, just watching. The next week, she was the one who took the package, murmuring an almost inaudible, "Thank you." Each small step was celebrated with a knowing smile between the two of them, as if they shared the world's most wonderful secret. Arthur, for his part, felt his own role changing. From a passive spectator and distant provider, he was becoming an active participant in his daughter's healing process. He began to read about alopecia, about the psychological effects of Laura's treatment. He wanted to understand, not just to find solutions, but to feel empathy. One night, while scrolling through an article on his tablet, he came across something about art therapy. The idea hit him with the force of a revelation. The following Saturday, he proposed the second major outing himself. He tried to mimic Isabella's approach, keeping his voice calm and the invitation light. "I was thinking," he said at breakfast, "that we could go to the art museum. Not to see everything, of course, but I heard they have a room full of paintings with an incredibly bright blue, the kind of sky blue you like. We could go for just half an hour. See the blue room and then get a hot chocolate at the cafe there. What do you two think?" Laura looked to Isabella, seeking approval. Isabella simply smiled and said, "I think a hot chocolate sounds delicious." This time, the car ride was less tense. At the museum, Laura wore a soft-knit hat she had picked out herself. The vastness and silence of the place seemed to protect her. They found the blue room, and the girl stood in the center, her head tilted back, absorbing the vibrant hues on the giant canvases. Arthur said nothing. He just stood beside her, sharing the moment, feeling the calm that emanated from her. At the cafe, while Laura focused on her hot chocolate, Isabella turned to Arthur. "That was a great idea, Mr. Pierce. Please, call me Arthur," he said, the request coming so naturally it surprised him. Isabella smiled. "Arthur, and you can call me Isabella." It was the first time they had used each other's first names, a small adjustment, but it signified a huge change. The line between boss and employee was dissolving, giving way to something more like a partnership, a friendship. Later that night, Arthur found Isabella in the kitchen, reviewing some notes from her college classes while waiting for it to be time to go home. "How are your studies going?" he asked, genuinely interested. "They're going great," she replied, her eyes shining. "It's funny, I read about child development theories in books, about the importance of positive reinforcement and creating a safe environment, and then I come here and see it all happening in practice. Laura is my best teacher." Arthur nodded thoughtfully. "You've been a great teacher too, for both of us." He left the kitchen feeling a peace he hadn't felt in years. The money he was spending on Isabella's education and her salary felt like the best investment he had ever made. It wasn't earning interest in a bank account, but it was yielding smiles on his daughter's face and teaching him, finally, what it meant to be a father. The bridge was being built, and for the first time, he felt like he was holding a hammer, too. The sunflowers in the backyard were now nearly as tall as Laura. The seeds she and Isabella had planted weeks ago, in an act of quiet hope, had grown into strong, green stalks, their large heads beginning to bow toward the sun. The flower bed, once a forgotten patch of dirt, had become the center of the small universe they had rebuilt. It was where they spent the end of many afternoons, the three of them together, watering the plants, pulling weeds, or simply sitting on the grass, watching the slow progress of life. On one of those afternoons, while Laura was focused on showing Arthur how a ladybug was crawling along one of the large leaves, Arthur knew the moment had come. The deadline for re-enrollment was just a week away. The letter, which had once been a source of panic, now seemed like just a piece of paper, an administrative task to be handled. He glanced at Isabella, who was sitting a little further away, reading one of her college textbooks. She felt his gaze and looked up, giving him a slight nod. A sign of encouragement. Arthur took a deep breath, gathering the courage he had learned to cultivate. "Laura," he began, his voice calm and unhurried, "I need to talk to you about school. The deadline to decide is coming up." Laura stopped tracking the ladybug, and her body tensed. The light in her eyes dimmed a little. Fear was an old ghost, easily summoned. Arthur rushed to continue, using the tools Isabella had given him. "There is no pressure at all. None. If you don't want to go back, we will find another solution. You can be homeschooled. We can hire the best tutors. The most important thing is that you feel safe and happy. The decision is entirely yours." He waited, his heart pounding. He had offered her control, the choice. He had opened all the escape routes. Now it was up to her. Laura didn't answer right away. She plucked a blade of grass and began to shred it with her fingers. She looked at the sunflowers, which seemed so confident under the sun. Then she looked at Isabella, who had closed her book and was now watching her with an expression of total acceptance. Finally, her eyes met her father's. She saw no impatience or disappointment. She saw only love and support. She thought about the bookstore, the museum. She remembered the little girl's stare and the comment that had hurt her, but she also remembered that the bad feeling had passed. She remembered the dragon from the book, who learned that his strength came not from fire, but from his intelligence and his big heart. She began, her voice a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, a little louder. I'll go. The relief that flooded Arthur was so intense he felt his legs might give out. He wanted to hug her, to lift her into the air, but he restrained himself, sensing there was more to be said. But, Laura continued, and now her voice was surprisingly firm, I have one condition. Arthur and Isabella exchanged a look of surprise. Laura lifted her chin, and the vulnerability on her face was replaced by a determination Arthur had never seen before. She brought a hand to her own head, in a gesture that was not one of shame, but of affirmation. I'm not going to wear the wig, she declared. No hats, no scarves. If I'm going back as myself. The silence that followed was not one of shock or hesitation. It was a silence of pure awe. In that moment, Laura was not a fragile girl in need of protection. She was a warrior declaring her terms of surrender to fear. She wasn't just agreeing to cross the bridge. She was deciding to cross it with her head held high, without disguise, exposing her most vulnerable part as her greatest source of strength. Tears sprang to Arthur's eyes. He knelt in front of her on the grass, not caring about the dirt on his expensive pants. Of course, sweetheart, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Of course you will. You'll go exactly as you are, and you will be, without a doubt, the bravest and most beautiful girl in that entire school. Isabella came closer, her smile as bright as the afternoon sun. The decision was made, not by them, but by her. The real climax wouldn't be the first day of school. The real climax, the turning point, had just happened right there in the garden, between three people and a patch of sunflowers. The first day of school arrived with the soft light of a September morning. There was a different energy in the house, a mix of nervousness and anticipation that seemed to vibrate in the air. Arthur had barely slept the night before, his mind replaying every possible scenario, from the most optimistic to the most catastrophic. But when he saw Laura come down the stairs, a calm washed over him. She was wearing her favorite blue dress, the one that matched the color of the sky. On her back was a new backpack, filled with notebooks and pencils she had picked out herself. And most importantly, her head was bare, pale and smooth under the morning light. There was no hesitation in her step, no attempt to hide. There was only a quiet acceptance, a resolve that seemed much older than her 8 years. Isabella was in the kitchen, making a special breakfast, pancakes with berries, Laura's favorite. She didn't act as if this were an extraordinary, danger-filled day. She treated it like any other Monday, a normality that was, in itself, the most powerful form of encouragement. The three of them ate breakfast together, the conversation revolving around light topics, the taste of the orange juice, a bird that had landed on the windowsill. No one mentioned school, or fear, or the courage that the day demanded. It was a silent pact, a way of saying they were all in this together, but that Laura was the main character, and she was ready. In the car on the way to school, it was Laura who broke the silence. Isabella, will you be there when I get out? I'll be right at the gate, Isabella replied from the front seat. I can be the first person you see. And you, Daddy? Laura asked, looking at Arthur in the rearview mirror. I'll be at work, but I'll have my phone on all day. If you need anything at all, I'll drop everything and be there in 10 minutes, he said, his voice firm and full of promise. The school was buzzing with activity, children running, parents saying goodbye, teachers organizing lines. For an instant, the scale of the scene seemed to swallow Laura's small figure. Arthur felt the old impulse to scoop her up, to take her back to the safety of home. But then he saw it. A girl pointed, a boy whispered to his friend. The stairs began just as Laura had feared. Arthur's heart sank. He looked at his daughter, expecting to see fear, tears, the urge to retreat. Laura stopped for a second. Her shoulders slumped a little. She looked at the ground. Arthur held his breath. This was the moment of truth. And then something extraordinary happened. Laura lifted her head. She looked at the pointing girl, not with anger, but with a serene curiosity. Then she turned to Isabella and Arthur. She didn't say anything, but her eyes asked a question. "Are you here?" Isabella knelt in front of her, adjusting the strap on her backpack. "Remember the dragon, Laura? What did he do when the others made fun of him?" A flicker of understanding passed through Laura's eyes. She took a deep breath, and then she took the first step toward the school gate, then another and another. She didn't run. She walked with a stunning dignity, her backpack bouncing on her shoulders, her head held high as if she wore an invisible crown. Arthur and Isabella stood on the sidewalk, watching her go. They saw her find her teacher, who greeted her with a warm smile. They saw her walk into the building and disappear from sight. Arthur felt a hand on his arm. It was Isabella. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she was smiling. "She did it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "No," Isabella corrected him softly. "She could always do it. She just needed time to figure that out." He turned to her. The man who had once been a stranger in his own home, the boss who barely knew his cleaner's name. Now he saw her as his partner, his confidant, the architect of the bridge that had saved his daughter. On impulse, he hugged her. It wasn't a formal hug, but one of pure, overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you, Isabella," he said, the words feeling too small for the emotion that filled him. "Thank you for teaching me how to be a father again." They stood there for a long time, two unlikely allies, celebrating the silent victory that had just taken place. The bridge had not only been crossed, it had become a solid, safe path to the future. 3 months passed. Autumn arrived, painting the leaves of the oak tree in the garden with shades of gold and red. The sunflowers, which had been the silent witnesses to Laura's transformation, now stood tall and majestic, their large heads heavy with seeds, their cycle complete. Like the flowers, Laura had blossomed in a way Arthur had hardly dared to dream. She wasn't the most popular kid in school, nor the most outgoing, but she had found her place. She had a small circle of friends who accepted her as she was. Children who had moved past their initial curiosity and now saw only Laura, the girl who told the best stories and knew the names of all the constellations. Seeing her running on the school playground at recess, her laughter floating on the crisp air, was a daily miracle for Arthur. His relationship with Isabella had also deepened, settling into a rhythm of partnership and mutual respect. The formalities had vanished completely, replaced by an easy, honest communication. They were no longer just the father and the tutor. They were the co-guardians of Laura's happiness, a team united by a common purpose. One Saturday afternoon, while Laura was at a friend's house for a birthday party, an event that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier, Arthur found Isabella in the kitchen, organizing her books for the upcoming exam week at college. "She barely hesitated when I dropped her off," Arthur said, pouring 2 cups of coffee and placing one in front of Isabella. "She just gave me a quick kiss and ran inside. It felt normal." Isabella smiled, the exhaustion from her studies in her eyes overshadowed by a glow of pride. "Because it is normal now, Arthur. It's her new life." Arthur sat at the table, the warmth of the mug in his hands. "I keep thinking about how lucky we were," he said, more to himself than to her. "Lucky that meeting was cancelled. Lucky you were here. But what about the other kids, the other families who aren't so lucky, the ones going through all this alone?" The question hung in the air, charged with a new weight. Arthur's gratitude had matured, transformed into a broader awareness. His vision, once focused solely on his own pain and his daughter's, was now expanding to include a world of suffering he had previously ignored. Isabella looked at him, recognizing the change. "It's one of the things we discuss most in my classes," she said. "The importance of support networks. So many families feel isolated. They think they're the only ones going through it. The loneliness is sometimes worse than the illness itself." Arthur processed her words: support networks, isolation. The words resonated with his own experience. He, a man of resources, of power, had felt completely alone and helpless. What about families with fewer resources, less access to information? His businessman's mind, the brain trained to see systems, structures, and opportunities, began to whir. But this time, the goal wasn't profit. It was purpose. "We could do something," he said, the idea forming in real time, something bigger. A place, an organization, a place where kids like Laura could meet, play, and see they're not alone. A place where parents could talk, share experiences, find support. Isabella watched him, her eyes wide, as the energy in the room shifted. This was the Arthur who had built an empire, but with a different fire in his eyes. "A foundation," he said, the word sounding right, definitive. "With my capital, we can rent a space, hire specialists, create programs. We can make a difference, Isabella, not just for one child, but for hundreds." He stood up, pacing the kitchen, his mind racing. "We could have support groups, art workshops, events. We can change how these kids see themselves." He stopped and turned to her, his expression intense. "But I can't do it alone. I know how to manage, how to fund. But I don't understand people, not like you do. I need someone to be the heart of the project." He took a step toward her. "I want you to be the program director, Isabella. I want you to take everything you did for Laura and multiply it. I want you to build this foundation with me." The offer was so immense, so far beyond anything Isabella had ever imagined for herself, that it left her breathless, from cleaner to tutor, and now director of a foundation. It felt like a dream, but looking at Arthur's determined face, she knew it was real, and she knew, with a certainty that came from the depths of her soul, that every hardship in her life had prepared her for this exact moment. A year later, the late summer afternoon air was filled not with the silence of an empty house, but with the most musical sound in the world, the laughter of dozens of children. They were gathered on the lawn of a large country house rented for the inaugural event of the Sunflower Foundation, the first summer camp for children with conditions that cause hair loss. Boys and girls ran across the grass, participating in painting workshops and storytelling sessions, most of them with their heads uncovered, proud under the sun. Arthur watched the scene from a distance. Leaning against a tree, he wasn't wearing his usual expensive suit, but a polo shirt and comfortable pants. A genuine, constant smile was fixed on his face, a smile that was now as natural to him as breathing. He saw Laura, now 9, at the center of a small group of newcomers. She was holding the hand of a shy little boy who was staring at the ground. "Being different isn't bad," Arthur heard her say, her voice clear and full of the conviction she had worked so hard to earn. "It's just different, and here we're all different together." Across the lawn, Isabella, now a graduate with honors in education, coordinated the activities with the calm and efficiency of a natural leader. She was no longer the invisible cleaner or the hesitant tutor. She was Director Isabella, a woman who had found her purpose and whose passion inspired everyone around her. The volunteers, the parents, and especially the children. Their eyes met over the heads of the kids, and they shared a smile of complicity and pride. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Arthur stepped onto a small stage set up on the lawn. A microphone awaited him. He looked out at the crowd of families, at the happy faces of the children, and felt a wave of emotion so strong he needed a moment to compose himself. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice firm but full of warmth. A little over a year ago, my life was very different. I measured success in spreadsheets and time in scheduled meetings, and everything changed because of one of those meetings, which was cancelled. He paused, looking directly at Isabella. It all started with coming home early. Sometimes, the greatest gifts life gives us come disguised as inconveniences, as unexpected detours in the road. He then looked at Laura, who was sitting in the front row between two new friends. I learned, through my daughter and an extraordinary woman, that true wealth isn't in what we accumulate for ourselves, but in how we turn our hardships into opportunities to help others. I learned that the most incredible people can be right in front of us, invisible only because we don't stop to truly see them. His gaze returned to Isabella, and the gratitude in his voice was palpable. The woman who now directs this foundation's educational program with such wisdom once cleaned my house. She taught me that strength doesn't come from the absence of fear, but from the courage to build a bridge over it, one step at a time. That night, under a starry sky, hundreds of people celebrated not just acceptance, but the pride of being exactly who they were. Arthur stepped down from the stage and went to find his daughter. Isabella joined them. Laura stood between them, holding each of their hands. The three of them looked out at the camp, at the community they had built from a simple act of kindness, born on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The future was an open road, and for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt no need to control it. He just wanted to live it. End of narrative.